Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you, Leo. Kind words. I've known Leo for a while. He was my first graduate student at the University of Colorado in Boulder before I went to the University of Notre Dame. And we talked Hopper a long time ago. So it's kind of fun to continue to do so today. So I'd like to begin by congratulating Leo for organizing this really terrific exhibit and helping us see Edward Hopper's artwork on the road, and in particular, his multiple pictures of hotels, motels, boarding houses, apartment houses, and rooms for rent, including, of course, this room. An immersive space for overnight guests. I love how that's framed. Inside the museum that is a simulation of Hopper's 1957 painting, Western Motel. This Hopper Hotel experience, which Leo designed, is completely sold out, which kind of bums me out, with lucky guests like Amanda Adams, who we see here, describing it as a bucket list event. She wrote a great article about this just a couple of days ago. So the overall picture of Hopper that we gather from this impressive exhibit is one of Hopper the traveler, often accompanied by his long-suffering wife, Jo Nivison, herself a painter who also posed for him. And the exhibit includes the display of several of Jo's diaries from the 1930s through the 1950s, in which she recounted, and maybe the proper phrase is kvetched about, their travels on the road, by train, by car, across America, and into Mexico. Jo also kept extensive notebooks charting her husband's paintings, describing compositional details, pale green walls, white ceilings, strip of grass green carpet, and she also included sales figures. Hopper's 1943 painting, Hotel Lobby, for instance, was purchased for $2,500. Can you imagine? By Henry Hope, a professor and chair of the Fine Arts Department at Indiana University, who then donated it to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Jo posed for both female figures in the picture, the older matron on the left wearing the hat and the fur coat, her feet sensibly planted on that verdant strip of green carpet, and the younger blonde on the right reading a book and sitting with her long legs stretched out, ready to trip up the next hapless tourist who walks into that hotel lobby. Now, Hopper's assessment of the social rules governing this public space borders, I think, on humor, especially as he hides the receptionist, that hotel staffer responsible for welcoming guests with a warm smile and friendly efficiency, way over on the right side of the canvas, behind that big green lamp on that long wooden countertop. We can barely see him. He's hiding on the periphery and covertly surveying the scene, sort of, I want to argue, like Hopper himself in so many of his paintings. Now, often when we travel, and Americans love to travel, we log some 1.8 billion person trips for leisure purposes alone in 2018. Often when we travel, we like to document our experiences. We take pictures of sunrises at the Grand Canyon. We take selfies on the National Mall or in Millennium Park in Chicago. And we post Instagrammable breakfast spreads fit for Gourmet magazine. We usually take these pictures in order to document or affirm ourselves, and of course, to share our experiences with others. How many of us have sent or received pictures on Facebook or WhatsApp of spectacularly curated vacation meals? But we also take these pictures to compare and contrast these images and these experiences with our normal, everyday lives back home. Travel is typically informed by our desires for difference, measured against our day-to-day routines like commuting and our return to where we started, home base. Not so Edward Hopper. Hopper's travels and his paintings of his travels reveal next to nothing about his experiences, and he never painted what he and Joe ate for breakfast. Sketching from a distance, Hopper never revealed himself, although when asked what he was after in one of his last paintings, the one we see here, Sun in an Empty Room, painted in 1963, he snapped, "I'm after me." Rather, Hopper painted the dwellings he encountered on his travels. Houses like this one of a plain white cottage with gingerbread trim in Cape Cod, where he and Joe stayed in the summer of 1933. Apartment buildings like these, which one critic suggestively suggests Hopper liked to observe endlessly, peeking through windows at night, or furtively surveying them just before nightfall. And hotels and motels like this one, which Leo notes in the exhibition catalog, resemble the inexpensive lodgings where the Hoppers themselves often stayed on their road trips in the 1950s. The Hoppers also stayed in tourist houses or rooms for rent when they traveled, like this Greek Revival-style house that Hopper painted in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Hopper was deeply familiar with how Americans made themselves at home in these built environments. He was also attentive to how dwellings change over time, how they adapt to different social and economic circumstances or succumb to disrepair and ruin. Recounting his travels and his pictures of houses and other dwellings, my talk tonight considers how Hopper visually negotiated these meanings of home and house in modern times. Now, my interest in the idea of home is based in part on spending a year in Denmark as a Fulbright scholar and learning about hygge. Hygge is a largely untranslatable Danish concept of coziness, conviviality, and hominess. The word is meant to evoke warmth, closeness, family, soft, cozy socks, and it is especially on display during the Christmas season in Danish homes, where everybody basks in the glow of holiday cheer and family and friends togetherness. It's quite a phenomenon, and the fact that it's apparently genuine and sincere is eye-opening for the average American skeptic, like me. Now, recently, various home decor and entertainment outfits in the US have tried to market hygge to Americans, so now we're all being schooled in hygge life and how to be cozy. Good luck. My point is this: Edward Hopper was the anti-hygge. None of his paintings of what were ostensibly homes were especially homey. They don't correspond to the warm, inviting, or intimate ways that home is often defined or maybe remembered. Hopper's take on home was more akin to house, to the architectural facts and styles of buildings, the slopes of their roofs, the details of their facades, their landscaping, their sidewalks. A large number of his paintings are identified, in fact, as houses, from haunted house to house by the railroad. And as these pictures suggest, he was very selective about the kind of house he preferred to paint. Hopper was hired, for example, to paint portraits of a few houses, which he grudgingly accepted. In 1939, American playwright Charlie MacArthur hired him to paint Pretty Penny, an Italianate-style house in Nyack, New York, where Hopper was born, where MacArthur lived with Broadway actress and movie star Helen Hayes. They bought the place, originally erected in 1857, for $1,500 in 1932, and they named it after The New Penny, a radio program in which Helen Hayes had a part. Hopper hated the place, telling Helen Hayes, "I don't want to paint this house. It does nothing for me. There's no light. There's no air." But in 1939, the Hoppers were broke, and Jo convinced her husband to do the commission. He balked, however, at including Helen Hayes' daughter and her French poodle in the painting. And Helen Hayes later recalled, "I had never met a more misanthropic, grouchy, grumpy individual in my life." But then Hopper wasn't interested in cultivating social relationships with collectors or in painting pictures of houses that might signify their meaning as home. In 1950, for example, Jo recorded in her notebooks that Hopper was at work painting the large oil Cape Cod morning, which she described as a scene of, quote, a blondish housewife appraising early AM weather in pink cotton dress. The painting, which she said was going rather speedily, in contrast to her husband's typically slow, even sluggish output, was about, quote, a woman looking out to see if the weather is good enough to hang out her wash. Hearing Jo describe Cape Cod morning this way, Hopper challenged his wife's interpretation, stating, "Did I say that? You're making it Norman Rockwell. From my point of view, she's just looking out the window." Hopper, in other words, rejected the storytelling that he saw at the center of pictures by Norman Rockwell, one of the best-known artists of the 20th century in the US, partly because of his steady visibility on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post from the 1920s through the 1950s. For Hopper, Cape Cod morning was a study in mass and light, expressed through a set of conventional compositional elements: landscape, architecture, figure. If Jo saw his painting as a picture of a housewife, wondering if she could hang up her laundry outside, Hopper saw it in terms of the specifics of space and light and architectural detail. His interest in these and other compositional specifics were rooted in commercial art. From 1899 to 1900, Hopper attended the New York School of Illustrating. There, he learned the mechanics of commercial illustration, drawing with ink, working in watercolor, etching, and using various photomechanical processes. He also, importantly, learned how to marshal these visual methods for maximum audience influence in print media, like the illustration that we see here that he made for American Magazine, among other very popular forms of print media. In 1900, Hopper enrolled at the New York School of Art, where he studied with painters William Merritt Chase, Kenneth Hayes Miller, and then beginning in 1902 with Robert Henry, and we can see him in the photograph here, sketching. Hopper also took classes with illustrators Arthur Keller and Frank Vincent Dumont, very successful commercial artists who did illustrations for books, magazine covers, and advertisements. This was the golden age of American illustration, with countless books, magazines, posters, and advertisements requiring hand-drawn visual imagery to help drive the nation's economic engine of consumerism. Hopper did his part, working as a commercial illustrator for over 2 decades, including a stint at the C.C. Phillips and Company advertising agency, which was founded by his fellow School of Art student Coles Phillips in 1906. Hopper then worked as a freelance advertiser at leading firms such as Sherman and Bryan, Barston, Durston and Osborne, and J. Walter Thompson, right through the late 1920s. Advertising accelerated in these decades, stimulated by more things to buy, cars, radios, telephones, and the manner in which consumption increasingly defined American national identity. As a commercial artist, Hopper was at the epicenter of this commodity-centered modern political economy. Although he would later say, illustration didn't really interest me, I was forced into it in an effort to make money, he was shrewd, he was prolific, and he was versatile, typically adapting his style to meet the requirements of each commission. Note his ease with adapting a linear Art Deco style for this illustration in Photoplay in 1921. And then the brushier, more romantic style that he used to illustrate the French movies The Gap of Death and Horrors of War, which appeared in a full-page ad in the Moving Picture World in June 1914. Hopper's wide-ranging graphic skills helped him garner many different commercial assignments, from magazine covers to story illustrations. In the New York City Telephone Directory of 1911, he listed his occupation as salesman. Like other salesmen, he shopped his wares door to door, traveling from one ad agency to the next to show off his portfolio and sell his skills. His focus on American scene subjects and spaces, from New York sidewalks to its drugstores, suggests how deeply attuned he was to the material or physical conditions of modern times. As such, Hopper was aligned with interwar demands for a national or native aesthetic. Hopper yearned to be recognized as a distinctively American painter. He visited Europe several times between 1906 and 1911 and traveled with Joe to Mexico 5 times between 1925 and 1957, living in foreign hotels and painting views of indigenous architecture. But during the heightened cultural nationalism of the 1920s and 30s, he sided with artists and critics, including Randolph Bourne, Van Wyck Brooks, and William Carlos Williams, in the call for an explicitly American, meaning US-centric, form of cultural expression. In a 1927 essay on John Sloane's paintings and prints, Hopper lauded Sloane's depiction of native types, like these fellows at McSorley's Old Ale House, an Irish tavern in the East Village. Likewise, in a 1928 article titled "Charles Birchfield, American," Hopper praised that painter's attention to the nation's uglier and more banal subjects, rather than what he sarcastically called picture postcard scenes. Birchfield, he said, was especially good at capturing, quote, "the look of an asphalt road as it lies in the broiling sun at noon, cars and locomotives lying in godforsaken railway yards, the steaming summer rain that can fill us with such hopeless boredom, the blank concrete walls and steel constructions of modern industry, midsummer streets with the acid green of close-cut lawns, all the sweltering, tawdry life of the American small town, and behind it all, the sad desolation of our suburban landscape." It's quite a statement. Hopper might have been describing, in other words, the banal subjects of his own paintings of the interwar American scene, like this watercolor of a box factory in Gloucester. And I want to add that I think Hopper was a very good critic and a very prolific writer, something that remains relatively understudied among scholars. In his own reckoning with the sad desolation of the American scene, Hopper navigated, as Leo mentioned, this concept of American cool, a tense emotional regime of inhibition, self-control, and feelings of restraint that emerged in the early 1900s and held sway throughout much of the modern era. Backed by new modes of social, economic, and behavioral regulation, including changed assumptions about middle-class family and gender roles, new expectations regarding appearance, respectability, and taste, an increased reliance on experts, including advertising agents, in domestic and professional fields, this new emotional style dominated much of 20th century American life. Hopper's assessment of its rationalizing discipline and its often alienating and disorienting effects is evident in many of his paintings at this time, including these of lonely, solitary figures in urban settings, such as Automat and Hotel Room, to his spare and similarly discomforting scenes of empty streets, stilled industries, stopped trains, and seemingly uninhabited houses in Gloucester, where the Hoppers honeymooned in 1924 and then visited again in the summer of 1928. Hopper's cool assessment of the materiality of houses was grounded in a larger national conversation and anxiety about tenancy and homelessness. Despite the exalted American dream of home ownership and the idealization of the standalone home as the private abode of the American family, many modern Americans, especially working class and middle class Americans, lived in shared, multifamily, multi-unit structures. Jack Delano's color photograph of two large multifamily houses on Rossiter Street in Brockton, Mass., once known as Shoe City, documents the quarters that many people occupied during the Great Depression. Shot in December 1940 on assignment for the historical section of the Farm Security Administration, a New Deal government agency tasked with visually documenting the social conditions of the Great Depression. Delano's photograph captures the former grandeur of the Second Empire Victorian-style houses that were built in Brockton during the second half of the 19th century to accommodate the tens of thousands of people who worked in the town's footwear factories. Hopper's House by the Railroad similarly focuses on a Gilded Age mansion built in the Second Empire style in 1885 in Haverstraw, New York, once the brick-making capital of the world. The first work of art acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, Hopper's painting depicts a house, still standing today, you can see it there on the top, on Route 9W, 30 miles north of Manhattan. The reputed source for the Bates Mansion in Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 movie Psycho. So we've got Hopper, Psycho, and Real House. It's also the inspiration for British artist Cornelia Parker's transitional object, Psycho Barn, a temporary installation in the Metropolitan Museum's rooftop garden in 2016. Abandoned by the early 1900s, the Haverstraw House fell into disrepair and was used by squatters until local district attorney Thomas Gagan purchased it in 1919 as a home for his fairly large family. His daughter Amo, who lived in the house for 41 years, later recalled looking out her second-floor bedroom window in 1925 and seeing Hopper across the railroad tracks, sketching the house on a canvas mounted on a portable easel. In the 1960s, this mansion was divided into 6 apartments and turned into a rental property. Nationally, from 1900 to 1940, renter-occupied housing outnumbered owner-occupied housing to great extent. Home ownership rates actually declined from 1890 to 1920, increased in the 1920s due in part to changes in mortgage financing, and then fell again markedly in the 1930s. Not until after World War II did single-family home ownership increase, such that by 1960, 62% of Americans owned and occupied their own homes. During the Depression, 40% of Americans lived in one-family detached homes, 25% lived in apartments, and the remainder lived in duplexes, residential hotels, or this kind of multi-unit dwelling photographed by Jack Delano. Many Americans who owned their homes rented out rooms to others. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of 19th century urban residents either took in boarders or were boarders themselves. Boarding and lodging so pervaded American life, writes one historian, that use of the term single-family home is misleading. In 1930, 14% of urban households took in boarders, and that percentage climbed during the Great Depression as it continued. Life magazine covers this phenomenon in this May 1941 photo essay of a boarding house on Kenmore Avenue in North Chicago, making light of the tight quarters and sort of oddball personalities, but emphasizing that, quote, home atmosphere is a major selling point of a good boarding house. Life's photo essay style paralleled the documentary aesthetic that was promoted by the FSA. Roy Stryker, an economist who headed the New Deal Agency's photographic survey project, aimed to document the nation's Depression-era housing conditions, including the types of homes that Americans occupied. So different photographers were assigned to take up the subject in different cases, in different cities. Delano in Brockton. In 1935, Carl Meidens was dispatched to Washington, D.C., where he photographed rooms for rent. In 1936, Walker Evans shot similar scenes in New Orleans, including this photograph of a house in the French Quarter. The sign on the left of the front door reads, "Furnished rooms and light housekeeping, week $2 and up." All over the country, including the spots where Hopper and Joe stayed on their road trips, travelers rented rooms in private homes. And this, of course, is not unlike Airbnb today. In a September 1935 article headlined, "America Goes Gypsying for a Vacation," the New York Times estimated that there were some 200,000 private homes in the US offering tourist accommodations. Homeowners have placed their second-best furniture in the spare room and erected a sign by the highway reading "Tourist Rooms," or perhaps something more enticing, such as "Twilight Rest Home," one writer observed. Although, frankly, if I saw that, I would not go. So, Twilight Rest, that sounds scary. In 1945, Hopper sketched rooms for tourists over the course of several visits to this house in Provincetown, using the dome light of his car for illumination. Again, his surveillance was furtive, even surreptitious. He later told a reporter, "Mrs. Hopper thought I should let the landlady know what I was doing out there, but I didn't want to intrude." In 1930, the Hoppers began spending their summers on Cape Cod, especially the outer Cape community of Truro, Massachusetts, about 10 miles from Provincetown. Hopper's painting Cornhill, Truro, depicts a location historically significant as the site where, in November 1620, the Mayflower Pilgrims first plundered a stash of food and water stored by the Wampanoag. Hopper focused on the clapboard tourist houses that sprouted in the region after the Civil War, when the railroad came in and tourism became the dominant economy. Edwin Roskin's 1940 FSA photograph, Tourist Home Truro, which is captioned, "The girl at the easel is a boarder, house belongs to incapacitated fisherman and railroad worker from the Cape Verde Islands," similarly shows the wooden fishing shacks that were converted into summer cottages for Cape Cod vacationers. In diary entries dating to May 1951, when the Hoppers went on a long road trip to Mexico, Jo Hopper took special notice of the tourist homes where she and her husband stayed. And these homes could be found all over the country, and they were often advertised with the kind of postcard that I illustrate here. So she writes, "Monday, May 28, about 1 p.m., left New York via Hudson Tunnel and Pulaski Highway. Mexico! First night left Penn Turnpike to spend a night at Carlisle, PA. Cold, damp, glad to stay in a house. Mrs. Stone's, second floor. After supper at Gulf Station, Howard Johnson's. Very deluxe counter food on Turnpike. Tuesday night, May 29, spent at Winchester, Virginia, again in a house versus more expensive motor court. Immaculate room, second floor, front with toilet and basin, with filmy white curtains, all new enterprise. Wednesday, May 30, night spent in Bristol, Virginia. One floor house of Mrs. Sutherland, we in front room, immaculate. She has 3 sons in the war, gave us strawberries from her garden. We ate supper in her backyard. Whether temporary or permanent, for leisure or business, co-living in shared spaces, including boarding houses, which typically offered meals, rooming houses, which had small private rooms, shared bathrooms, and no meal plan, tourist homes, duplexes, 3-deckers, multi-unit buildings, apartment buildings, and residential hotels, these were the norm for a majority of Americans well into the 1950s. Reasons for this are numerous, most notably the prohibitive cost of buying a standalone single-family dwelling. Homeownership among minorities was further prohibited by racial discrimination. including FHA, Federal Housing Administration policies that denied low-income housing loans to people of color and backed racially exclusive suburban developments intended for whites only. Likewise, while motels date to the advent of automobile travel in the early 20th century, the word motel was actually coined around 1926, they were typically segregated until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. African American tourists relied on the Negro Traveler's Green Book, an annual directory published from 1936 to 1966 for a list of lodgings, gas stations, restaurants, and other on-the-road amenities that served Black consumers. And I note that on January 26th, the museum will be hosting a conversation on the Green Book, which sounds absolutely fascinating. The highway motel of today only became standard after World War II. It flourished with the development of the nation's interstate highway system, with soaring rates of car ownership, the cultural popularity of the middle-class family vacation, especially the family on the road in a car, which Susan Roop wonderfully explores in her book, Are We There Yet? And it was also propelled by a 1954 federal income tax provision of accelerated depreciation, which basically made the construction of new buildings a lucrative tax shelter. Until then, many people, including the Hoppers, rented rooms in tourist houses when they traveled. Ben Shaw's FSA photo of this hand-painted sign advertising Rest Haven somewhere in central Ohio, which he shot along Route 40 in the summer of 1938, shows the kind of place where they might have stayed. One of the most significant factors driving American patterns of tenancy was and is mobility, the belief that individuals are rightfully entitled to travel. Brokered by Enlightenment-era jurists like William Blackstone, who argued in the 18th century that personal liberty consists in the power of locomotion, of changing situation, of moving one's person to whatsoever place one's own inclination may direct. Freedom of movement is recognized as a fundamental, if hard-won, constitutional right in the United States. Human movement was central to the nation's economic growth, especially in terms of occupational mobility. Even today, the average American will move residence more than 11 times in her or his lifetime, usually for reasons related to work. Housing evolved accordingly to accommodate the movement of citizens and visitors alike. Like mobility, home is a dominant American trope, but its meaning is not solidly or permanently fixed on physical place or property ownership. The common cliche, home is where the heart is, implies that in America, home is a feeling, a sentiment based on social intimacy and bonds of affection. Hopper's repeated visualization of houses and hotels embodies in part his interrogation of these ideas about home in modern America, about where it is and how we do and do not hold on to these feelings. Hopper is especially well known, I think, for his interwar pictures of urban New York, including his iconic paintings, Early Sunday Morning, a critique of New York University's encroachment in the 1920s on the red brick row houses that once dominated Manhattan's Lower East Side. And you'll note on the far right of the painting is this looming skyscraper-like form. He's known for Nighthawks, a disquieting scene of four people seemingly trapped inside a diner in a decidedly Twilight Zone setting. A longtime New Yorker, Hopper lived and worked in the same Greenwich Village apartment from 1913 until his death in that apartment in 1967. But he was also an inveterate traveler, telling a Time magazine staffer in 1948, "To me, the important thing is the sense of going on. You know how beautiful things are when you're traveling." A few years later, Jo recounted in her diary, quote, "E wants to buy a new fast car, load in luggage, and take to life on wheels. Is this speed thirst something that gets into one's blood like drink? Heaven forbid." She added, "What is he running away from? Not me when he's taking me along." He's always been crazy about New York and plenty scornful of all the places where we've set foot down. It's the road that enters the eye and feeds a thirst. Jo's observations about the impact of the road on Hopper, on how mobility and speed nourished his eye, were astute. Despite their seeming stillness, Hopper's paintings, and Gas, painted in 1940, is a great example, often feature ephemeral sights and subjects, things seen in a flash, out of the corner of his eye, as if driving quickly past. As one writer observes, a road cuts across the foreground of most of Hopper's paintings. Sometimes it becomes a city street, or a railroad embankment, or a porch step, but it is there, a constant reminder of transience. We see that road, that metaphor of speed and mobility in so many of his paintings. Hopper's focus on mobility, on what the French poet Charles Baudelaire called the fugitive, fleeting beauty of present-day life, was shaped by modernism's contingency. His attention to older examples of vernacular architecture, and especially their decline and their decay, was related. Hopper was both fascinated and repulsed by these bulky Victorian houses, outfitted in ornate and eccentric detail: tall turrets, dormer windows, decorative spindles, wraparound porches. By the 1920s, when he depicted them in paintings like House by the Railroad and Haunted House, these Gilded Age piles had long outlived their symbolic capital as markers of taste and affluence, as well as their physical usefulness. Think of how much it costs to heat these things. And many had fallen into disrepair. Hopper's depopulated scenes, further stripped of contextual references such as cars and trees, characterized Victorian houses as moldering dwellings that refused to die. They were, as the title of this 1926 watercolor of this boarding house in Rockland, Maine suggests, spooky. John Vachon's 1938 FSA photograph of this massive Victorian house in Omaha, perched on a hill, surrounded by an untended lawn, and hiding two tiny figures hovering on the front porch, also conveys this haunted feel. Built in the 1880s for Nebraska's first attorney, the James Woolworth Mansion was the first house in Omaha to have electricity. In the 1920s, it became a rooming house. Note the signs on the left reading sleeping rooms for rent and 2211 St. Mary's Furnished Apartments sleeping rooms. In 1950, it was torn down. In the 20th century, art historian Sarah Burns observes, Victorian houses became the prime, sinister locus of the modern American imagination, symbolizing an indulgent, diseased, and corrupt past. Hopper and Vachon saw them as architectural dinosaurs, looming on their American acres like awkward aliens. They weren't alone. Post-war movie directors like Alfred Hitchcock and William Castle similarly cast these Victorian houses as creepy, haunted houses. And likewise, popular insurance companies pointedly depicted Victorian houses as the dark and uninhabitable dwellings of a pre-modern past. Compelled by movement, by travel, by mobility, and the search for self, the houses that Hopper painted offer us fascinating insight into an unrecoverable American past. And that, I think, helps to account for the enduring appeal of his pictures today. Home for Hopper was transient. While he shared with other American moderns a focus on definitive American subjects and scenes, his treatment of each was informed by austerity, dissonance and vulnerability, a cool style of restraint and control, an edgy uncertainty that circumscribed the modern era that he painted. Thank you.